Tonight we've invited to partner with us an organization called CS Teaching Tips. CS Teaching Tips is an organization that collects pedagogical tips around computer science concepts and how to deliver them to a diverse audience. Tonight we welcome Colleen Lewis and her team to lead us through one of their Tip-A-Thons. We're going to become tip generators. And they're going to go up, hopefully, if they're good, they're going to go up on the CS Teaching Tips website. And you might get a follow-up from Colleen. She's going to tell you all about this when I was doing the opening. We're going to be breaking up into small groups. We'll be kind of brainstorming with each other. We'll be entering in some information in a Google form. So hopefully some of us have computers that we can get connected to the local Wi-Fi. And then we'll be submitting these forms with these teaching tips so that hopefully Colleen and her team can curate and use to develop their website. This is a website that I go to a lot. It gives you how do I teach walking over a list again? Or what should I do in Scratch if my kids aren't liking it? This kind of stuff that it's not a full lesson plan. It's just like the go-to for I need to get through this thing and I need a little trick for it. And it's very, very cool. But it's only going to be excellent if we all pitch in and start putting tips in. And hopefully this will be just the tip of the iceberg where we all start to become tip generators.
Awesome. Welcome. Thanks. And so let's start by thanking the CSNYC for inviting me and this amazing food. I'm so happy to be here. Yay! Okay, so I'm Colleen. Do you see, so I'm a computer science professor at Harvey Mudd College, but this is you. So like Eric explained, you're the change maker. Maybe you're a teacher, maybe you're not a teacher. And so I'm really here in maybe not totally altruistic ways. I want to talk to you so that I can get your tips for how to make computer science accessible. Okay, that's my end game. Okay, so let's talk about the things we're going to do. I'm going to start and tell you who I am. We're going to talk about CS Teaching Tips, what that project is, go into a little bit more detail, explain some of what we're going to do when we go into breakout groups. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my research around diversity and equity. I'm going to talk about Harvey Mudd College, which is where I work. Raise your hand if you've heard of Harvey Mudd. Oh, raise your hand if you've heard that we have a bunch of women in studying computer science. Oh.
It's Maria Claw, yes?
Let's talk about this. Yeah, it's Maria Clave who works there. She's like a famous computer scientist. I maybe didn't know who she was before I applied for the job, so... Oh, this is videotaped? No, it's fine. So we're going to talk about Harvey Mudd, what's happening there. We've got a bunch of women and some other stuff that we're doing there that I think you're going to be excited about. I'm going to tell you more of the sort of meat grinder logistics of this Tip-A-Thon and how it's going to work. Okay. So I will try not to have Colleen, that first one, Colleen's picture. We'll try not to have that one last too long. Okay. But as an introduction, here's what I'm about. My personal and professional goal is to make computer science more accessible for all students. That's what I think matters. In my research, I try and do this by understanding and optimizing learning environments. And in my research, I try to understand and remove barriers. Okay, so this is both my research focus, and then when I get to teach sixth graders, I'm doing this, and when I get to teach at Harvey Mudd College students, I'm doing this. And if I thought that I could be more effective at doing this in some other way, I would be doing that. Does that make sense? So if you're, I'm a little bit like a dog with a short attention span, so I'm like squirrel, but this is what matters. I think that, raise your hand if you're on board with the first part, right? I think that seems, okay, I think we're in the right place. Okay. So this is, again, the Colleen portion. So I grew up in Fresno, California, and I had this crazy opportunity that every child should have the opportunity to have, which is I went to public schools, and my public school had computer science. So in 2nd grade, I did logo. Who's done logo? In 7th grade, I did hypercard. Anybody for hypercard? What? In 9th grade, I did basic. Yeah, basic. Okay.
It's like my curriculum.
So much fun. Let's talk about this. I never made a decision to do this. It was just like, oh, like I went to school, I had pretty good attendance, and so this is what I had access to. Then I went to college at Berkeley, and I was like, oh, you know, someone told me since I like math and science, I should be an engineer. Okay, cool. What kind of engineering? I don't know. So I took a computer science class that was for engineers, and I'm in the class, and I'm like, I am awesome at this. Like, awesome. No connection in my mind to the fact that, oh, I started in 2nd grade. Like, this is the same stuff, like if statements. Other people are like, whoa, what's an if statement? How are we gonna loop through this stuff? And I was like, I'm just really, really good at this. Turns out I was really good at it, you know, in my first semester of college, because I had been doing it since 2nd grade. And that's the thing that every kid should have access to, that every kid should have the opportunity to get to experience, where it's not something they have to opt in. They don't have to be convinced that they're gonna be into it. I never would have checked a box being like, I'm gonna become a computer scientist. No, thank you. But I ended up as a computer scientist, mainly because at Berkeley I met a woman, and she was like, well, Colleen, I'm gonna be a computer scientist. And we study really well together, so what if you took this next class? And semester after semester, she talked me into that, and we would go to the first day of class, and I'd be like, Irene, we're in the wrong place. Other people know what they're doing. We do not know what we're doing. We should definitely drop this class. And she is stubborn, and I did not drop those classes, and one class I dropped because it was going so poorly I was going to fail, but other than that class, I did not drop those classes, and I majored in computer science at Cal. Okay, then, but something happened while I was at Cal where people would say, Colleen, you're such a people person. You won't like sitting in a basement coding until 3 in the morning. Has anybody had people tell them that? So here's what I figured out my senior year of college. My good friend Mark, who's super gregarious and he's a people person, he was shocked that anyone had ever said this to me. No one had ever said that to him. No one thought he was too much of a people person to be a computer scientist. And it helped me understand some of what was happening. So have people heard the term microaggression? Okay, so microaggression are these things, I think micro sometimes is the wrong word. Sometimes they're macroaggressions, but they're these little things where, here's an example that I currently get. People say, Colleen, you're too young to be a computer science professor. And I'm like, oh, you just think I don't look like a professor. Do you know what? Do you know my male colleagues who are or look younger than I am? No one tells them that they don't look like a computer science professor. It's these little things where people, when someone says I look too young to be a computer science professor, please don't say this to me, I think, oh, I don't belong. Maybe that's not what I necessarily need to be hearing, but that's what I hear when someone says, you look too young to be a computer science professor. And same thing when someone says, Colleen, you're too much of a people person to be a computer scientist. And I think the thing about this is, and I'm gonna silence my phone because I think people are tweeting.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's great. Yeah, but I think it would be annoying if this kept going off. Okay. Okay. And the thing I realized is these people who were telling me to not major in computer science were doing it out of my own self-interest. They were trying to be really kind to me by being like, Colleen, I think this is the wrong fit for you. Okay? So they had just wonderful bunnies and happiness in their heart and were trying to extend that to me. Okay? Here's the catch. They had in their mind what a computer scientist looks like, and I didn't match it. And those ideas about what a computer scientist looks like, that's, I think of as implicit bias. They didn't have any explicit bias. They weren't saying women are too stupid to do this. I just didn't fit with their underlying unconscious assumptions about what was about who should be doing this. And so I think it's important this is slightly tangential, but I think these terms are important in terms of thinking about our students and their experiences in this space. Something I think is really unique at Harvey Mudd is a lot of faculty every day are thinking about what are the ways in which my implicit biases are negatively impacting my students, and what can I do about it? Right? And if you're not talking about that, and if you're not talking about the fact that I'm being unintentionally, unconsciously sexist or racist, then you have no potential to be able to change any of the actions or any of the realities of the students you're working with. Okay, so I think those terms are important. Okay, next I work at Leapfrog making educational games. It was super fun. I loved working in industry. And every weekend when I was working in industry, I was trying to teach kids to program over like Saturday and Sunday. So I'd be like, oh, what if I like email, have the Girl Scouts email something out, and then we'll get together at my apartment and I'll like teach groups of them to code, okay? And then I went to grad school, and that like thing I was doing in my free time became my job. It was so cool. So I went back to Berkeley, because why move? And Berkeley's awesome. And I did a master's in computer science and a PhD in education, really to try and move me down this path of how do I make computer science more accessible. Now I'm at Harvey Mudd College as a computer science professor. It's unreal. It's like such an awesome place to work. And part of why it's an awesome place to work is this idea of privilege. So at Harvey Mudd, I mentioned we have a bunch of women. And so when I teach classes, they're 40 to 50% women. When I walked into classes at Berkeley in the computer science major, it was 11 to 13% women. And for the first time in my life as an 18-year-old, I became hyper aware and in some ways ashamed of my gender. Okay, so I walked into spaces, and that's what I was thinking. I was not so different than everybody around me, but how I felt was different than everybody around me. And so for many years, I was doing that. I also started wearing like more grays. Do you know what I mean? Just kind of blend in, like let's not create waves. I am wearing a lot of loud colors now at Harvey Mudd. When I go into classrooms, I am 0% aware of my gender. Do you know what? That's awesome. That is privilege. And so I think we think of privilege, if you're like, oh, normally we don't talk about privilege so positively, but that privilege of walking into a room as a woman computer scientist and just feeling like a computer scientist is rad. And I want all of my students to have the opportunity to have those privileges. And if they don't have those privileges, I want to unpack with them what's happening in their experiences. And that's where it really got me thinking about allyship. Okay, so I had this, sort of one 10-year transformative experience of understanding like, oh, here I didn't have privilege, here I did have privilege. It's so different in those worlds. It's so different in those worlds. But there are so many dimensions of our identity. And I've got white privilege all the time. I've never known what it's like to walk into a room and be aware of my race. Maybe that's not totally true, but the big picture is, I've always been white, and when I walk around the world, people interact with me as if I'm white. So the point is, you shouldn't need an experience where you don't have privilege to think critically about privilege and how important it is to be an ally. But this is part of my experience and how I've started putting names to those experiences. Okay. I teach, when I went back to grad school, I got to teach Scratch. Who's taught Scratch? Yeah? Okay, who's never seen Scratch? Okay, that's cool. It's a programming language. And the Scratch stuff I did with 6th graders starting in 2008 became the Beauty and Joy of Computing course. Raise your hand if you've seen that. Raise your hand if you've never seen that. You are welcome here. I'm sorry, I want people to get the opportunity to raise their hand a lot, but I don't mean to exclude you if you're like, oh, I had never heard of Logo, HyperCard, Basic, yada, yada, yada. I think we're gonna do a little bit of Scratch. in here, but the rest you'll be able to figure out and it'll all be more accessible. Okay, and now I've got a course online on edX, programming in Scratch. So it's about 30 hours of instructional time. It's really hard. It's like a lot of computer science packed into a course, okay? We'll cut out the really hard part, but it's just like, it is essentially the first 4 weeks of this college level course, but designed for younger kids. So I don't assume that kids know variables. Okay, so I teach kids and do some of my research with 6th graders. And we're gonna be talking about more of my Scratch specific, programming language specific research on Saturday's Meetup. Okay, here we go. We're gonna talk about the basics of this CS Teaching Tips project. It's funded by the National Science Foundation, thank you. We're at CS Teaching Tips, and tonight we're using the hashtag CSTT. So if anyone else is tweeting. Okay, and we send out tweets, 3 tweets a day with some of these tips. So we've got 720 tips at the moment, last time I checked, and it's based on interviews with more than 100 teachers. It could be you that also does these interviews. So I pay people $50, we Skype, we chat for about an hour, we write up a bunch of tips. You will already be like veteran tip writers from coming to this. Tonight I'm not gonna pay you, I'm sorry, but when we talk, if you talk on the phone, then we do pay you. Okay. Little shout out, this is my team from 2014. I'm gonna have another team of students working on it. These are some wonderful Harvey Mudd students. They rock, okay. Okay, so what's in a teaching tip? So we've got content knowledge, which is like, okay, do you understand computer science? I'm sorry, I keep walking behind the pillar. Yeah? Okay, no, but then people can't see. Okay, so we have content knowledge, which is computer science in this room. And then we've got pedagogical knowledge, which is just, for your age group, what are sort of appropriate things? How do you teach? How do you manage classrooms? Stuff that's not specific to your domain or to the domain of computer science. And then at this intersection is this computer science specific teaching knowledge, okay? Pedagogical content knowledge. So that's, how do I teach arrays? Where will my students have trouble when they learn about arrays or lists, etc.? Okay, so that's the space we're in. And how I was motivated to do this was, okay, I've got some code on the board. Here, if you haven't seen Scratch before, don't worry, if we just read the words, we'll be fine. So this block starts when the green flag is clicked, and it sets a variable count to 0. And then it repeats until count is greater than 2. And what it does inside there is it says hello, and then it changes count by 1, which means add 1, and then it says goodbye. So I was TAing at Berkeley, a computer science course, and I had a student who was working with code that looked like this, but in Java, I think it was. And I figured something out. My student thought that right after count became greater than 2, it would leave the loop. So as soon as that condition became false, it would leave the loop. And it would never say goodbye in the end. Yeah? Okay. So I had this deep insight into student thinking, and I was so pleased with myself. And then I went to tell this guy, my advisor, Mike Clancy, who had been teaching computer science for a while. This is, let's not lie, kind of an old picture. Yes, and so I was like, Mike, I figured out this thing with loops like this. Students are confused because of X. And he was like, yeah. He was like, of course. And I was like, you knew that? And you didn't tell me? Like, what else do you know that you're not telling me? Do you know what I mean? It was like, it made me really mad that like in that man's head was a lot of stuff that was gonna make me a much better teacher, right? Understanding where students were gonna have trouble, what I could do to help them. And I was like, we need a website because I'm mad at all of you computer science teachers who haven't told me how I could be a better computer science teacher. Yeah, so that's what this is really all about, is like, oh, Mike, hey, let's as a community get together and write down all of these deep insights that are specific to teaching computer science. So that the world can have them, so that when we get a new computer science teacher, we're like, oh, dude, check out CS Teaching Tips. It'll be cool. I'll help you find some of the like really high value stuff. Check these ones out. Okay, so that's the plan. Here's another one which I think is just too good. And I was really pleased with this insight. So this is repeat 1, play note 60. So my students were like, oh yeah, this plays the note 60 twice. And I was like, they're like, yeah, because you do it, and then you repeat it once. And I was like, oh man, that is really, really sensible. Yeah, really sensible. And you know, if I have, now that I know that that's like a thing kids think, like repeat 0, they think, oh, well, I do it once and then I repeat it 0 times, so it does it once. Knowing that helps me understand the problems that students have and their reasoning process. Here's another example. If you work with your students writing code in a language that has automated testing. So what I do is if you give students test cases, list debugging strategies inside the test cases so that students see the debugging strategies when they look at any broken test cases. So if you've got automated testing, it's like, oh, man, this one doesn't work. And then the student goes and looks at what that test case is, and you give them like, oh, if this test doesn't work, try adding print statements. Try, and you can give them a bunch of stuff. And in there, I provide the actual test cases that I give to my students. And I also provide an explanation of like, why do I think this is helpful? Okay, so that's trying to get you a sense of like this pedagogical content knowledge, the sort of computer science specific tips. So tonight, our plan is to write tips about diversity. But I want to complexify that a little bit more. As logistics sort of rubber hits the road, what we'll do is we'll have you write tips in small groups, and then we'll format them and proofread them and attribute them to you. Unless you want, you can make a note in them there if you'd prefer them to not be attributed to you and just be anonymous. And we'll post them on csteachingtips.org. So you don't have to worry about like spelling or punctuation or grammar. My team might kill me for saying this, but just don't worry about it. Just put the ideas in there. What's really important is the detail that you provide. So if you can provide code samples, that's super helpful. If you can email me a worksheet and then be like, oh, I emailed you this worksheet that you should also post with the tip, that's super helpful. Okay. But I want to talk for a second about what we mean by diversity. And in particular, thinking about, in one person, we have a lot of identities, okay? So, you know, I don't think of my own identity or my students' identities as a singular. I think of it as a plurality of identities. And there are identities that come out in different places. And what I find is that when we often talk about students who are underrepresented in computer science, right? African American and Black students and Latino students are underrepresented in computer science. And so that's one dimension of their identity, okay? But each of our students have so many dimensions of their identity. And so when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about, you know, how can we increase the participation of students who are underrepresented in computer science? But the dimension of their identity, which makes them underrepresented in computer science, is unlikely to be the dimension of their identity that we target with interventions, okay? So I want to think about this of, you know, you probably don't customize your instruction for your students' Blackness, but you probably customize it to match their interests, their background knowledge, their perspectives, their experiences, their values, their languages, their social context. What else am I missing? What are other things about your students' identities that you need to customize your instruction for, or might ideally customize your instruction for? Yeah?
Their abilities.
What's that?
Abilities.
Their abilities. So one thing is background knowledge, but I think background knowledge and skills
like
or other.
ability, like,
yeah.
You know, they're like emotional stability. Like, do they have learning disability? Do they have speech and language impairment? Are they emotionally disturbed? Those things. Also.
Yeah. Right. And so, yeah.
I'm just going to say emotional state.
Oh, yeah, emotional state. Other things that we're missing up here? Yeah.
For gender, I mean, sometimes girls or boys are more interested in
one particular type of game, and I taught at a single-sex school. So, because it was a single-sex school, we did push things and change it for gender.
Yeah, and so the thing I want to push back on is it wasn't their gender identity and how they view their gender identity that you had to design the curriculum around. It was around patterns of interest in your population. And so there are going to be dimensions of students' identities that we have to design around. So I have one where specifically I designed this tip around race. So I have in my Scratch course, one of the things kids can do in Scratch is they can open a paint editor where you like modify the different pictures. And I have a very strict rule against that. Unless one of the people that you want to use is not the color you want that person to be. And so for my black students, and this is specific to that dimension of their identity, they can use paint and change the color of these characters. But I find all of my other teaching practices are about things that aren't related to their gender or their race in particular. That they're related to their interests or pattern of that population's interests. Let's do a check-in. Thumbs up. I feel really good about this. Like, let's focus on some of these other dimensions versus like, I'm not totally sure what you're talking about. Okay, cool. I think of no vote or like fingers under seats votes sort of as votes down, but we're gonna keep going. But here's my plan is we're gonna try and write tips about diversity, but in doing that, we're gonna try not to conflate dimensions of our students' identity. So they're interested in a particular type of music. So let's write a tip about students who are interested in a particular type of music. And then a teacher can be like, oh, well, are my students interested in this particular type of music? Because that's the relevant dimension what we're trying to match our instruction for. Yeah? Okay. And again, you're gonna write tips in little groups, and we'll format them. You don't have to worry about that. Okay. We're gonna talk about some science. We might like pick up the pace a little. And you're like, Colleen, would it be possible to talk more quickly? And I'm gonna try. Yeah? This part is just like, oh, you know, Colleen, how do you spend your free time? It's doing this research. I love it. So we're going to talk about challenging the use of gender as an explanatory variable, kind of talking about this same intersection piece. Exploring college students' perception of their fit with computer science, finding gaps in, we'll call it thoughtfully designed learning environments. I was doing my best. And changing narratives about who can succeed in STEM at Harvey Mudd. Okay, so challenging the use of gender as an explanatory variable. So here's one thing is it's a really common thing to say, boys and girls are different in this way. Boys tend to be more active, say as one example. Okay, and so, but then when you dig into that, originally someone might think like, oh, well, boys are more active. That means if you gave me a random boy, it'd be helpful to know that he's going to be more active because he's going to be more active on average than the average girl. Okay, well, the average boy and the average girl may be different in how active they are. But if you give me any random boy or girl, they're going to be somewhere within this spectrum. And actually, these spectrums tend to be mainly overlapping. You know, so the thing that really matters when we're talking about these differences in boys and girls or any of the other dimensions is what's the actual difference between the mean? And does the size of that difference between the mean give us good predictive value given a single individual where they'll fall on this spectrum? Yeah? Usually not. Right? Okay. And so, but here was a narrative that happened, background. At Berkeley, I'm sorry. At Berkeley, we had, here's the main intro course. I just left the numbers up there, which is CS61A. You don't need to know what that is. It's just like the main meaty intro computer science course. And then there's another one that's a main meaty intro computer science course, okay? Before that, students come in 2 tracks. One, they take AP Computer Science in Java in high school, or they take CS3, which is what they used to take, and it's an intro computer science to get them ready for this first meaty computer science course. Okay? Here was the narrative we had at Harvey Mudd, at Cal. In CS61B, this second course, women get lower grades. Okay? It doesn't happen in 61A. They do fine in 61A. You know, men and women are performing equally. But then when we get here to CS61B, which focuses on data structures, and we're not sure, but there's something that women just aren't as good at about data structures. This was the narrative. And so there, it's individuals' gender identity was used as an explanatory variable for why they were not good at data structures. So, you know, it was like, well, we don't know why, but it's their gender, and they're not as good at it. And we see a substantial difference in the mean between men and women in this course. Okay. Context. This is taught in one language. This is taught in the same language. APCS is taught in Java. CS61B is taught in Java. Can anybody see where I'm going? Huh? Okay. Yeah. Women take a lot of AP tests. Women take calculus at really high rates. But women don't take AP computer science at really high rates. And so actually, if you give me a random woman, their gender is a good predictor of whether or not they've taken AP computer science, and therefore whether or not they have Java experience. And it turns out, if you control for prior Java experience, there's no difference between men and women's grades in that second course. And the more interesting thing, I think, is of different instructors that we looked at, the gaps between students with and without Java experience were of variable sizes. Right? So if you really take on responsibility for some of your students in 61B have not seen Java before, like that it's not as much of a handicap to not have seen Java before. Okay, so this is this idea of that gender and race is not an explanatory variable. And so whenever we see a pattern like that, we have to dig deeper to understand what's going on. I don't mean to discount what we talked about before around microaggressions, right? And microaggressions and privilege. But I think we can talk about the mechanisms by which microaggressions and privilege work and operate, such that it's not just their race or gender. Their race and gender does shape how people interact with them in the world, but there might be ways as educators of digging below that in terms of what sort of things we're going to address. Okay. I'm interested in how students decide whether or not they fit with computer science. And so this, I looked at students with 2 colleagues at the University of Washington, Seattle, and at UC Berkeley. And we talked to about 30 people, each for like 30 minutes to an hour, really in depth. You're taking an intro computer science course, either CS1 or CS2, which is just intro, or the second one. You know, how are you deciding whether or not to major in computer science? And what was really important here is trying to understand students' lived experiences in those courses. So the student said CS1 is like taking a foreign language class, but the majority of students are already native speakers. You think that'd help you, but teachers just adjust to the native speakers, so people who are new to the idea get left behind in the dust. Okay, so my research is trying to understand these experiences because I think through understanding students' experiences, we can do a better job of designing our classroom environments. Things that came out through these interviews is really important in how students shape their decision to major is their perception of their own ability, their perception of whether or not they fit as a computer scientist, whether there was some utility to them of the world of studying computer science. Some of them, they were like, well, I'm a senior and a bio major, so I'm not going to change. There was too much opportunity cost, or their enjoyment of the topic. right? Sensible things. We've been looking at this idea of how they're assessing their ability. And in particular, they were looking at their grades, how quickly they could do things, and their previous experience, okay? But these things seem to be shaped by their experiences in those environments of competition. So it wasn't just that they were evaluating their grades, how quickly they did things, and their previous experience, but compounded by that. Another piece that compounded it was their mindset about ability. Who's heard of Carol Dweck? Yeah, okay, a few. So we had students in our interviews talk about this process of deciding if they fit. And we labeled them as this idea of a growth mindset, which is Carol Dweck and a lot of other researchers use, which is this student said success in CS2, that's the second semester course, is basically all up to you as far as how much you want to put into it and learn, or I'm sure if I try hard enough, I can learn. This is what we want all of our students to think. Here's a less productive version or mindset is CS ability is something that you're just born with. I guess because programming comes to me pretty naturally. So this idea, either positive or negative, that your ability is innate. It's some geek gene, you're born with it, and it can't really change or grow. That's this idea of a fixed mindset. Whereas what we want our students to think is that with learning, working hard and great teaching, we can learn and learn anything that we want. Okay, so that's Carol Dweck. If you haven't heard of it, her book Mindset, I think, is really interesting. And in understanding students' experiences, one thing we wanted to understand is where were these ideas coming from? And I put this one up partially, it's just heartbreaking, but the student said, even my professor told us that some people are just born that way, with the mental outlook that's compatible with CS. They feel it's so easy for them. Yeah, and he told the rest of the people that some of you will try, but you won't get it. And it's just that your mental outlook isn't made that way. It's something you're born with, you can't help it. So here's the thing is, the student felt comforted by this. You know? You know when students are meeting with you and they're struggling and they're emotionally distressed by that challenge, and you want to make that emotional distress go away. This person took the unproductive strategy of saying, don't worry, it's just that you're not made to understand this, okay? Sort of reinforcing those notions of a geek gene. So in this research, I'm interested in sort of unpacking students' experiences as they're making these complex decisions about what to major in, what classes to take, etc. The thing that I'm working on with my collaborators right now is how they're assessing their fit. It's a little similar to, people telling me I didn't belong because I'm a people person. So we're looking at how people take different stereotypes about computer science, like male, asocial, competitive, obsessed. How they're taking some of those stereotypes and saying, well, is that like a pattern among computer science professionals? Or is that a requirement of the computer science field? And so in this way, we're seeing sort of a layering of these Dweck ideas of, is there some like fixed characteristic about these people that matters versus is it this malleable thing? Well, yeah, everybody's X, but I'm Y, but it's cool. X was just a pattern. It wasn't a requirement in the field. Okay, third research project, finding gaps in thoughtfully designed learning environments. And here I've got one of the researchers, Roxanne's here joining me. I haven't gotten to see her since we did this research or since we were Skyping every week. But Niril Shah is not here. He's at Michigan State University. And we, on some of the earlier work, worked with an even larger team. Okay, raise your hand if you've heard of pair programming. Yeah? Raise your hand if you've never heard of pair programming. Awesome. Pair programming is the idea that two people share one computer while they're programming. Okay? And we take different jobs. So one person will be the driver, and they use the keyboard and the mouse. Another person's the navigator, so using a driving metaphor here. And then you switch who's driving and navigating so that both people get a chance to be hands-on, but it ends up being super collaborative. Okay, give me 2 or 3 ideas of why might pair programming be awesome? Like why might I want to do this in my class? Yeah, Ruben.
Forces you to verbalize your thinking and verbalize computer science.
Yeah, it forces your students to verbalize their thinking. It's awesome. Gina.
Do you even like do heterogeneous grouping so that they learn from each other?
You can do heterogeneous grouping so that they can learn from each other. Yeah.
Two different perspectives for one problem.
Yeah. Even, showing explicit valuing of two different perspectives on one problem, and that within their problems, they get two different perspectives for one problem. Other reasons we might want to do that? Yeah.
Keeps both students on task.
It keeps both students on task. Yeah. Teamwork, right? So embedding the importance of teamwork in your classroom. Okay. A lot of awesome reasons to do it. And so I was like, oh yeah, I'm teaching 6th graders like by myself for the first time in 2009. And I was like, here's what I'll do. We'll switch roles every time an alarm rings, or like every 5 minutes we'll have students switch roles. Okay? And I explained, that's not the funny part, just wait. And I was like, oh, it'll be great. I'll use my phone. It'll ring. When it rings, I'll say switch drivers. Raise your hand if you have recently shared a computer with someone. Oh my goodness, it's super frustrating. Do you know? And I had students for 3 hours a day sharing a computer. They were not literally fistfights, but they were nearly fistfights. There were certainly like, I'm the navigator, Roxanne's the driver, and I like elbow her out of the way. All I did, all of my instructional time, was manage the fact that my students were fighting. Epic disaster. All the wonderful things you want, none of the benefit. Okay, we got together with so I taught a number of times between 2009 and 2012, every summer, so 2 times in between that. And I kept refining this practice of how, I wasn't ready to give up. So I kept refining this practice of pair programming. And in particular, so I kept it that students switch every 5 minutes. 5 minutes seems like not a long time if you're the driver. It feels like a really long time if you're the navigator. Okay? And I put in practices for how they switch. My students before would be like, oh, well, you told us to switch, but then we just had one more thing to do, so we didn't switch. And so the students weren't actually switching, and they never knew whose turn it was, and it was a mess. Now what happens is, say, Roxanne's going to keep being my prop, I'm sorry. So say Roxanne's being a jerk, and she was driving, the music plays, that means we're supposed to switch, and she doesn't switch. But here's the practice we do when it's time to switch. We both stand up, we give each other a high five, and then we switch chairs. So what that means is when Roxanne's being a jerk, I hear the music, I stand up, and then I'm just standing there. And Roxanne is like, no, one more thing. And then as a teacher, I'm like, wait a second, not everybody sat back down. Colleen, what's going on? Roxanne, Colleen, let me mediate so that you actually switch driver and navigator. We practice on the first day. I don't know how much that matters. I think the standing up piece really, really matters. But we practice on the first day every minute. It makes 5 minutes seem like a long time. Yeah? Okay. I have tried to avoid unnecessary negotiations. So if you let students make decisions about, if there are 2 computers in front of them, which computer are they going to use? If there are 2 kids, who's going to start as the driver? What's going to happen is the more dominant student is going to get to use their computer and start as the driver. And so I try and remove those negotiations by saying, if you're on this side of the room, your partner A, we're going to use your computer. If you're on this side of the room, your partner B, you're going to start as the driver. I was surprised that kids wanted to use like the computer that was in front of them. But that was a thing, and so I tried to remove that negotiation. I also, before kids were fighting about like, you did it when it was my turn, so now I'm going to do it when it's your turn, and I don't remember whose turn it was, so it's probably my turn. All the time. So now I just keep a scratch project up in front of the room that says, is it person A's turn or person B's turn? And it automatically plays the music every 5 minutes, so I don't have to remember. And then every day, we would do role plays. This course was actually co-taught. And so my co-teacher and I would do a role play where we would include some very good things and some very bad things. And then have students reflect on like, well, how do you think Colleen felt when that happened? right? So trying to understand and unpack some of these experiences. And we could see little micro or macroaggressions that kids did, and then play them out in role plays and have ways of talking to kids about it. And once you've talked about like, oh, remember how Neryl was super bossy with Colleen yesterday? Maybe we have a similar situation like that going on here. Let's talk through that to give kids some of the language they might need. Okay. In this research, we're looking at these kids were from our class and have all given permission to be viewed. And we'll cut this slide out because viewable in a room like this, but not viewable on the internet. But we were looking at this one student, Jason, and his pairings with 4 other students. And Jason was one of our lowest performing students, and these other 4 students were some of our highest performing students. And we audio recorded their interactions and then looked at who was doing the majority of the talking, who was issuing commands, like bossing the other person around, and who was asking or having people ask them questions. Okay? And trying to look at, can we use those 3 metrics to get a sense of how equitable these partnerships are? And we had done all this work to try to make these partnerships not an epic disaster like we had in 2009, like we had really thought about it and a lot of dimensions of it. But we still were not totally successful. So here's Jason talking to Aaron. If you haven't seen the scratch block, when D key pressed, you put code under there that will run when the key D is pressed. So Jason says, so what next? And says, when D key pressed. Jason says, D what? Control tab. Oh, here? Just press D? Don't just press D, go to the control tab. When space key pressed. Do you see that? Space key pressed. This? Yeah, drag it out. Change it to D. Okay, so there's this. This is just an excerpt of what was happening in their pair. In this classroom that we had with these practices where we had thought really critically about how to try and make this equitable, to try and have both students have a say, we end up with Aaron issuing commands and Jason asking clarifying questions, okay? This next part I don't do super well with, is Jason the next day talking to Neryl about something, who was one of the teachers as well, said, I don't remember how to do it because when we did it, well, I didn't do it. Aaron did. I was there, but I didn't really. And he kind of trails off. It's like, right, these are our students, you know what I mean? And getting these, being able to see this interaction that happened within that pair. And then, after the fact, right, this is 2012 that these students were in the class. And then later on, the next day, how this impacted Jason's opportunity to engage with that concept. His perception of his understanding of that content is upsetting. But, okay. We're going to talk about happier things for a second. And that's I think that's important. I think the work we're doing, sometimes I find it super depressing and like, oh man, I'm a terrible teacher. Wish I wasn't a terrible teacher. But we got what we got. And so trying to understand what's happening there. But Harvey Mudd, some good things are happening at Harvey Mudd. And in particular, I'm excited about Harvey Mudd's potential to change the narrative about who is successful in STEM. Do you want me to go back for the picture?
Thank you.
Okay, dude. Harvey Mudd and Berkeley, which is another place I was, used to have not a lot of women, so about 11% women in 2004. And then come 2014, Harvey Mudd had 43%, and UC Berkeley had 21%. Okay, you've heard of Harvey Mudd. I want to get a rough sense. Who thinks that Harvey Mudd has at least 100 students? Okay, yeah, we've got 100 students. Who thinks Harvey Mudd has at least 1,000 students? Nope. We have 812, I think it appears on a later slide. It's a super, super, super small school that is very well funded and has a lot of faculty members who care a lot. And I mean a lot.
So, wait, 800
students,
total.
the whole thing.
Is that because of the consortium with Pomona and
So
other?
we're with other colleges, and our college is just very small.
Is it the smallest one of the group?
I don't know. It's one of the smaller ones of the group. Mackenzie, do you know? She doesn't know either. She went to Scripps. It's bigger than Harvey Mudd. Okay, but here's why. Okay, so you're like, whatever, why does what happens at a school with 800 students matter? It does. So here's an actual conversation. A faculty member in computer science says, hey, I've heard you have a bunch of women in computer science at Mudd. And I'm like, yep. And then they say, we don't. We must be doing something wrong. I'm like, probably. It's this amazing opportunity to start a conversation, okay? So they're like, well, they don't know that we have 800 students. Hopefully not that many people watch this video and find out we only have 800 students.
I'm not tweeting that.
That's great. And so we can with a small community, you can make big change quickly, and you can change this conversation, right? I feel like we don't go a week without hearing about Harvey Mudd having a lot of women in computer science. I mean, I follow their Twitter feed and yada yada, so I see everyone, but it's in there. It's changing the narratives, I think. Part of how it's changing, so I want to talk about what they've done. This is Marie Clave, she's the president. And one of the things we do that you're like, well, that's not scalable, is we send students to this conference, Grace Hopper Celebration of Women in Computing. We spend about $50K a year.
And the registration just opened yesterday.
The registration just opened yesterday. It's a hoot and a holler. It's great. It's a wonderful opportunity for students. It helped create the change that we've got at Harvey Mudd, but it's maybe not super scalable. But this still matters because Harvey Mudd can change this conversation, and other people can do some of the things that we did at Harvey Mudd. I wasn't actually there. I started there in 2012. So they made all the changes before I got there. I am responsible for none of them. We're just trying to keep the train moving. Okay, so they redesigned the intro course to be modular. So it's modular, so you might hate one part of computer science, and that's cool. Because you see there are 6 other parts that I kind of like, and one that I really like, okay? So that's, I think, a best practice that other schools in their intro course can use. We send students to Grace Hopper, like I said. We encourage women to pursue research after their first year. Here's one that no one talks about, is right at the same time, they painted the depressing basement labs with beautiful murals. One is like happy clouds, and the other one is like this beautiful birch tree forest. So you like walk in and it's just like birch trees all around. I think it's nice. Okay, so some of these things are super expensive. Send all of your students to Grace Hopper. Some of these are not. And the thing that was, even when we had 11% women in our major, the faculty all believed that all of our students could be successful learning computer science. And I think a sad thing at the college level is that there are not a lot of departments that have that unanimous belief, okay? Because there's a lot of ideas around innate ability. Okay, here's why, let's talk about this. At Harvey Mudd, students major in physics, chemistry, math, biology, computer science, engineering, and a few percent a year major at one of the other colleges that are in our consortium in a different major, okay? But you're gonna major in STEM, basically, if you come to Harvey Mudd. We've got 800 students, and our current population is 4% multiracial, 1% African American or Black, 9% Latino, and within the multiracial, that includes students who identify like one of their races as African American or Black. So they're not in the African American or Black, they're only in multiracial, okay? Here's the class of 2019. 7% African American or Black, 21% Latino, 12% multiracial. Here's the beauty of Harvey Mudd. Here's the small numbers. This is 14 students. But what we do is we've started calling all of our students of color and all of our first generation college students and anyone else who's underrepresented at academic institutions. We, as a faculty member, make a phone call, okay? And so these are students that were already getting into our programs, but we weren't able to recruit them. And by recruiting them, we can make Harvey Mudd a school where Black students go. when you have 800 students, if you have 14 more black students and 14 more students in this multiracial category who identify at least one of their races as black or African American, you can change what the school looks like. You can make it not look like a historically white college or university, which is what it is, okay? And so this conversation I had around we don't have women succeeding in computer science, we're probably doing something wrong. I think Harvey Mudd is poised for the conversation around we don't have students of color succeeding in STEM, we must be doing something wrong. And I think the answer is yes, you are doing many things wrong, and let's come to the table and talk about what you can change. Okay. We're on to the Tip-A-Thon. This talk went longer than I maybe expected. How do you feel about this, Eric?
I think we can do a half hour of the Tip-A-Thon.
That's great. Okay, so we'll do one round of tips. So good tips aren't going to conflate dimensions of students' identities. So right now I want you to think about 2 to 3 specific topics other than variables and recursion, because everybody comes up with tips about variables and recursion. So just for yourself, as someone with some top CS topic you've taught to students. I'm not going to make you say it out loud. Think about it. Okay. We're going to go onto computers, and we're going to ask you for what are the actions, what are the goals, what are the reasons. So like, what do you want to try and achieve, and how might those actions help you achieve that goal? Excuse me, any extra information you can provide is great. We're also going to ask you for your name and email address. If you don't want us to email you again, you can just put in a garbled email or just any text. If you're going to be working in teams, so you might list your collaborators. And once and only once, tell us your background, just like, oh, you know, I work in 6th grade, or I teach 8th grade, or I don't teach computer science, or whatever. Okay. Now I want you to find a team, and we're just going to go nearby because I've taken so much of time talking. So I want you to point to people around you that are going to be in your group, and just point to people around you and look for other people who have no one pointing at them, right? So point at people around you. Someone needs to make sure Roxanne's in a group. Look around you. Does everybody have somebody? Eric is going to wander. Yeah? Okay, I'm going to pull you back.
We have phones. Give me phones.
We're almost there.
Is it a Google form?
Oh, you don't want us to do this
Google,
yet?
not yet. Okay, wait, come back, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I have my students do that every day in class, and they do it very quickly, and then they're ready for the instructions. I'm like, point to the person you're going to talk to. Okay. Turns out, because there's only 800 of them. Okay. Great tips are detailed, but messy. We'll proofread them, we'll do all that jazz. They're specific to like, you know, here's something you do one day. Here are like actual words you would say to students. They include code if it's applicable. They're often things you've learned from other teachers. So what are some of those tips you've learned from other teachers? And they have clear actions. Okay, you're going to go to, I'm going to tell you before we break up, but here are some ideas to get you started thinking about those topics, thinking about how do you connect those topics to your students' interests, their background knowledge, their skills. How do you, it might not be, you know, working with students based upon their emotional stability might not be related to a specific topic. It might be pedagogical knowledge rather than pedagogical content knowledge, but we're cool with that. Yeah, so you might give us some tips that work for math teachers or English teachers. That's cool. But we want to say, you know, for your students that you know so well, what are dimensions of their identity? What are some of these other pieces that you design and modify your instruction for? And you're going to go to csteachingtips.org/contribute and do this. Okay, I'm going to say thank you very much. Thank you for letting me come. I'm sorry I talked so long, and we're not done because we're still going to do a bunch of, we have a raffle, and we're going to work in groups. So if you, so right now what we're going to do is you're going to go with your group either around, like, you know, in these tables, if it won't be too loud for you. We've also got, in these chairs, we've got tables over there. We've got a room back there. Okay, ready, go. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So good. We love you.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we don't know if we can offer like, well, the two of us are.
We're talking about, so we teach a high L population.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot of language issues.
Yeah.
So we're talking about that, but
So I think understanding what are, if I have a student who has limited fluency with English, what should I know are going to be unique difficulties that they're going to face in my class? Are there things that come up? Is it, particular to computer science? Or, there might be, I think that there's,
I mean, just all the verbal skills come up. Like, so with pair programming, explaining what they're trying to tell their partner when they're
so what do you do about that? Are there things that,
like scaffolds.
yeah, and thinking about, are there things that you're like, oh, actually, language isn't a barrier here? Do you know what I mean? Like specific problems to start with where you're like, oh, we can cut through some bullshit and like, you can really dig into some of the intellectual content without being annoyed that I'm explaining stuff in English. Do you know what I mean? Are there, if you come up with one or two, even one would be awesome. If you put your contact information in there as you're thinking about it, or, as you're working with a student, you might have one that comes to you later on. Do you know what I mean? Of like, oh, it's so hard to have this knowledge out of the context.
Yeah.
If I had a student here who was trying to learn things, one person could work with the student and be like, oh, you're doing all this stuff that we both do, but isn't tacit, or is tacit. That's the right way. Is unconscious. Yeah.
But also it's one of those things where as a teacher, when you're doing something, interacting with the kid, it's when it pops in your head because you recognize something that they just did, like, that's what I want you to do, but now how do I get you to keep doing that? So
Yeah.
like, that's an element of it too.
If you're up for being interviewed over Skype and paid $50, at least contribute that as a tip, and hopefully have interesting conversations. Yeah, okay. One suggestion for tips is to talk about an anecdote about a specific student. I had a student who was interested in X and Y got them jazzed. Or I had this think of a specific student and come up with, tell us about that student and what happened. And then other people can think about like, oh yeah, my students are into that and I might be able to generalize this. Yeah, okay.
We didn't have tons of time, right? So I really don't want you to feel like, oh, we didn't get a tip done. But a few groups, I think you might have gotten a tip done. Or you might have like really learned something about somebody in your group, because there was all these really great conversations where people were like meeting each other and like it takes 15 minutes just to like find out who's in my group. What tip did you write that you really are excited about, or who did you meet that you're really excited about?
And Carrie might be able to share a tip.
Hello.
Yeah?
Should I stand up? I'm Carrie. I currently teach HTML and CSS to low-income girls through CodeEd. And one thing that I've started doing this semester to help our girls with class discussions and oral exercises is to put a glossary on the board. Before they walk in the classroom, put a glossary of symbols. So, we'll use like, this is a less than symbol, this is a greater than symbol, this is a semicolon, this is, we try to use kind of colloquial terms that they'll recognize, so squiggly bracket, things like that. And then when we call on them to debug code or to talk to us about some code that they just wrote, they can just look up on the board and really quickly find the words they need to describe it.
Thanks. Thank you.
It's really cool.
We didn't actually get to write the ticket, which we're trying to very quickly do. What we all sort of came away with from our various discussions was that you have to make sure that the kids put themselves into the projects. Anything that you make it too distant or too esoteric, they're not going to buy in. So, make the project about them, make the project about their interests. They'll come to the code.
And if we could come up with 10 examples, if everybody goes home and puts in one tip about how they let their kids bring part of themselves into the code. There's the About Me project. Okay, what are 10 other ways in which you can have students bring themselves into the project?
can tip. So whenever I create handouts for students and I include some of the code that shows, like with robotics, I would show like how to use a light sensor, and then I would give a handout that had the beginning of the code to start. But I would always, because there's some kids that want to just copy the handout, and I never want them to just copy the handout. So I always included a bug in the code that I put on my handout, so that if they copied it, they wouldn't
They still
have it
get
work.
to debug.
They'd still have to figure out like what was wrong, and they would say to me like, "Why? I did exactly what it says, but it still doesn't work." I'm just like, so.
Awesome, good one. Yeah.
Others?
So my tip tonight is going to be turning all of you on to the EarSketch curriculum and the EarSketch online editor tool, which I think is the most amazing thing that I've ever seen. That is EarSketch, one word, .ga Tech, that's Georgia Tech, it comes out of Georgia Tech University. So it's a media lab, it's a media department, computer science department collaboration. It is music programming in Python or JavaScript. It is literally music programming. With access, they have this like beautiful interface with over 2,000 professional samples, half of which were published by Young Guru, Jay-Z's DJ. For the past 16 years, Jay-Z has toured with this DJ. They collaborated with these guys to build an online music programming in Python tool, which I think is so awesome. So if you want to sell computer science, if you want to sell actually, turns out hip hop happens to be a computational subject. And it actually literally is, and there's this great Wall Street Journal article about this DJ and how he codes Jay-Z's music. So that's my tip for tonight.
You
Earsketch.gatech.edu.
can Google EarSketch. It's good.
Awesome.
Oh, my kid's gonna be so in. I'm doing it tomorrow. They're not here tomorrow. Doing it Friday.
You are going to make sure to see Cindy on your way out to collect your Donor's Choose gift card, right? You're a teacher, you're getting that Donor's Choose gift card, which you could use on your own project, or on your colleague's project, or on somebody's project. You're going to follow up with Colleen, or Colleen's going to follow up with you if you send an email, if you put your name in that form, and then you're going to get $50.
You can get a sticker or pens.
Stickers, pens,
Or business cards out on the table.
And if you got...
Please take this.
Oh yeah, we have a lot of stuff, so stickers to take home. Thank you all so much for coming. One more round of applause for all of our participants. Good night, folks.